Hello and welcome to ACT review for the English portion of the ACT. We're going to look at passage 1. A few things to remember when you're taking the English portion of the ACT. You're going to be reading 5 passages. Each of those 5 passages will have 15 questions for a total of 75. You have 45 minutes to complete this work in. That may sound like you're going to be pressed for time, but I would suggest to you that it is adequate time to read all 5 of the passages. It's important that you read the passage, not just the underlined portion, because it establishes context for you. And if you'll notice here in this version of passage 1, you've got this boxed information that you could skip and it would be okay, but it tells you that the following paragraphs may or may not be in the most logical order. Each paragraph is numbered in brackets, and question 14 will ask you to choose where paragraph 3 should most logically be placed. So if you read through the whole thing, when you get to question 14, you're not going to lose valuable time by going back and having to reorient yourself to the logic of the passage. So if you know going into the passage that paragraph 3, there's going to be a question about it in this particular set of questions, it's good to know that and read for the context as you go. A couple of other things to remember about the ACT. In English, you are trying to drill down and find the specific grammatical problem and figure out the solution to it. So it's not a guessing game of just randomly picking where a comma ought to go or shouldn't go, but it's about drilling down and deliberately thinking about what is the basic grammar rule that's behind this question. And if you'll notice in the format of the questions, you have 4 choices, and generally, unless you've got a question like 14 and 15 at the end of a passage, it's going to have no change as an answer. And so, statistically speaking, if each of those choices has an equal likelihood of being the correct answer, that means no change is the correct answer roughly 25% of the time. 1 out of 4 times, it's going to be no change. A lot of times, students that I work with are reluctant to pick no change because it feels counterintuitive that there should be a problem that I should be fixing. If you were to take this test and never pick no change, then you're guaranteed to miss 25% of the questions. So don't be hesitant to mark no change. Even if it comes as the correct answer back to back or even 3 in a row, don't let that get in your mind. It's kind of a psychological trick. Or if it's the first correct answer in the passage, that doesn't necessarily mean that you've picked the wrong answer. So don't be hesitant to pick no change. Also, it's very valuable on the English portion of the ACT if you can determine if it's a question about wordiness, eliminating wordiness. And so if you see that the choices are redundant, needlessly repetitive, or if they're just too verbose, the language is too inflated. It's either way too formal, way too informal. There's just extra verbiage there that doesn't make sense. If you can recognize that as a type of question, then you can always pick the shortest answer and be correct. Now, that doesn't work on every single item on the English portion of the ACT. You've got to recognize it as a question about eliminating redundancy, wordiness, and verbosity. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to work through the first passage with you, identifying, drilling down and identifying the specific grammatical error, and then finding the correct solution. We're going to read the whole passage together for context as well. Here's number 1. In 1948, graduate students Norman Woodland and Bernard Silver took on a problem that had troubled retailers for years: how to keep track of store inventories. And so if you look at the choices, you'll notice that all the choices move the commas around. So this is a question about commas, but it's specifically related to an appositive phrase. So repeating Norman Woodland and Bernard Silver, that's called an appositive. An appositive renames a noun or a pronoun that comes before it. And so the question here is this a restrictive or a non-restrictive clause? And another way of saying that, or phrase rather, another way of saying that is essential or non-essential. If a phrase is marked off by commas, it means it's non-essential. In other words, let those commas represent marks where you could take a razor blade, slice it, cut it out, let the sentence collapse in on itself, and you wouldn't lose the grammatical integrity of the sentence, and it would not become ambiguous. In other words, it's very clear who you're talking about. So it's asking you, is this an essential or non-essential portion? If it's not essential, then you can put commas around it. But to say in 1948, graduate students took a problem that had troubled retailers for years, if you take that out, as it's indicated here, it becomes ambiguous because you don't know what graduate students. That's very vague, very open. And so what it tells me is that's an essential part of the sentence, therefore no commas are necessary. And the choice that does that is C. So listen as I read it. I'm going to pause where the punctuation should be. In 1948, graduate students Norman Woodland and Bernard Silver took on a problem that had troubled retailers for years: how to keep track of store inventories. And so where those natural pauses occur, that's where you're going to have punctuation. In this case, there's no commas around the appositive phrase because it is essential to maintain the clarity of the sentence. All right, here's number 2. Inspired by the dots and dashes of the Morse code, however, Woodland and Silver created a system of lines that could encode data. This is a question about transitions. And so it's asking you is however, which is a contrast transition, appropriate here that they use the Morse code to develop a system of lines, or is it in other words, which that's a transition of exemplification or giving an example, or consequently that's cause and effect. Really, there is no connection here that needs a transition. And so the best option is delete. So it's not an idea that's contrasted, it's not an idea that it's exemplified, and it's not an idea that is a cause effect. No transition is needed. Incidentally, choice J is the shortest answer because you're taking a word out and making it more concise. Remember, ACT is all about being concise as you write. Say it in as few words as possible. The first barcode was composed of 4 white lines set at specific distances from each other on a black background. Now look at your choices. You've got distances as the first word. You've got distances, locations, and links. Distances from each versus distances so that each was separated one from the other. Locations, each one set apart from the other, or lengths of distance. Now what do you begin to notice here? B, C, and D are all very wordy. And so that should be a clue to you that this is a question about eliminating redundancy and verbosity. So I want to opt for the shortest answer, and it just so happens that the way it is written is the shortest answer. A, there's one of our no change answers. 4 is a boxed question, and this one happens to be about the preceding sentence, the sentence that comes before it. Anytime I've got a question like this, I want to read before and after, and you'll see why. The first barcode was composed of 4 white lines set at specific distances from each other on a black background. The first line was always present. Depending on the presence or absence of the remaining 3 lines, up to 7 different arrangements were susceptible. Now, if I were to delete this, does it make any sense to have the sentence that comes next? Can I say, depending on the presence of the remaining 3 lines, if I haven't established that there's an initial first line? Well, no, that doesn't make any sense. So the question says the writer is considering deleting the preceding sentence. Should the sentence be kept or deleted? Well, if we delete it, it doesn't make any sense. So we know it's got to be kept. Now, why? Kept because it begins the description that is completed in the sentence that follows, or kept because it gives a clear image of what the first barcode looked like? Well, it doesn't tell you exactly what the first barcode looked like, but it is a description that is completed in the sentence that follows. So here's the key thing. If you just read the preceding sentence, you are not equipped to answer that question correctly. Read before and after the boxed question. Number 5, this is a diction question, root word of the dictionary. It just means word choice. And so here, susceptible is the wrong word. You would not say, depending on the presence or absence of the remaining 3 lines, up to 7 different arrangements were susceptible. You would say that 7 different arrangements were possible. And so it's a matter of picking the correct word choice, the correct diction. By the way, diction on the ACT is always going to be formal. So if it just sounds too colloquial or too casual, it's never going to be the right answer. Number 6 is a verb tense question. Today, 29 white lines making more than 500 million encodings possible. That's not correct, and that's not a complete sentence. I need the simple present tense, which is make. 29 white lines make more than 500 million encodings possible. All right, question number 7. To create a barcode scanner, Woodland and Silver adapted technology from an optical movie sound system. Their prototype scanner used a 500-watt bulb, a photomultiplier tube, a device that detects light, and an oscilloscope, a device that translates electronic signals into readable information. Although successful, the concoction was both large and costly. All right, so this is another diction question. When I think concoction, the connotation is a liquid mixture. Well, this isn't a liquid mixture. This is a combination of real, tangible parts from a movie sound system, a photomultiplier, and an oscilloscope. So the correct word for that is it's a contraption, B, because contraption has as its connotation physical, tangible parts that are put together. Number 8 is another transition question. It says, although successful, the contraption was both large and costly. Now I need to transition into large and costly, progress stalled until the 1970s. So what I have here is a cause and an effect. For example, is exemplification. That's not cause and effect. As a result is cause and effect. However shows contrast, and even so also shows contrast. But what I want to show is cause and effect. So as a result. In today's scanners, a laser sends light back and forth across a barcode. While the black lines absorb the light, the white lines reflect it back at a fixed mirror inside the scanner. So you got a pronoun here, it. We need to figure out what the antecedent is. The antecedent is the noun that the pronoun takes the place of or refers back to. So it here is referring to light. We would not change it to them, ones, or one because it is correctly paired with its antecedent, so it is no change. We've got a box question for number 10. This one happens to be about the paragraph that follows. Which of the following true statements, if added here, would most effectively lead into the new subject of the paragraph? Typically on the ACT, passages are arranged chronologically, and this one shows me that it's chronologically in the second word. It says 1948. And then if you just follow that development down, you're going to find that it goes in a chronological order. 1948 is when it began. Then they developed their own prototypes. By the 1970s, they were able to have some cost-effective materials to do that in today's scanner. So we're moving into modern times. And so when you look at this true statement here, are we going to go back at this point in chronology and say 1940s? No. Are we going to say 1952? No. Are we going to say 1970? No. But we can say barcodes themselves have advanced as well. Today, and then continue with our sentence. So it maintains the chronological order of the essay. Number 11, today, being that there are 1- and 2-dimensional barcodes using numeric and alphanumeric symbologies. Is that a complete sentence? No, it's a fragment. So we need to change that so it's an independent clause. Independent clause just means it's a sentence that can stand alone. An independent clause has a subject and a predicate. So this is missing either a subject or predicate. Which is it missing? It's missing a subject. So we've got to find a choice that provides a subject. So if we choose B, today, there are 1- and 2-dimensional barcodes using numeric and alphanumeric symbologies. There serves as the subject of that sentence. It makes it a grammatically correct independent clause. Number 12, in one study, for instance, tiny barcodes were placed on bees tracking their activities. All right, so the problem here is with the verb form of tracking. Okay, so if the barcodes were placed, the correct verb here would be to track, right? We need an infinitive phrase. So were placed on bees to track, and that would be choice J. 13, shaping the way we gather, track, and share information, we have almost certainly exceeded Woodland and Silver's expectations. Anytime you have an introductory phrase acting as a modifier, this happens to be a participial phrase because you've got a present tense participle here functioning as an adjective, that means it needs to modify the first noun or pronoun that occurs after the comma that marks off the introductory phrase. If it doesn't accurately modify it, it's called a misplaced modifier. And here we have a misplaced modifier. Shaping the way we gather, track, and share information isn't about us. It isn't about we. It's about barcodes. So the first word to come after that comma needs to be barcodes. And choice C does that. So that it reads, shaping the way we gather, track, and share information, barcodes have almost certainly exceeded even Woodland and Silver's expectations. That makes it a correctly placed modifier instead of being misplaced. We were warned at the beginning of the passage there would be a question number 14, and it says, for the sake and logic and coherence of the essay, paragraph 3 should be placed. Well, remember we talked about chronological order? Is it in chronological order? 1948, then we go from first barcode being composed, then they create it, and later in the 1970s it becomes more accessible, then today, and finally we've got the advancement. So actually, it is in chronological order, so it's F, no change where it is now. And then 15 is an author's purpose question. It's asking you, suppose the writer's primary purpose had been to describe how a specific technological advancement changed business practices. Is this essay about business practices? No, it's about the specifics of how a technology was developed. how a barcode was developed. Would this essay accomplish this? So we can say that we can eliminate yes because we know no, it doesn't do that. Is it no because it focuses primarily on the development of barcodes, or no because it focuses on why businesses needed new technology? Well, it doesn't give us the why, but it tells us the how. It tells us how barcodes were developed. As you move through the English portion of the ACT, remember to look for ways to make it the most concise as possible and think about basic grammatical rules. You should know some basic grammar rules, like when to use who versus whom, when to use it's with an apostrophe or without an apostrophe, how to correct run-on and run-on sentences and fragments, making sure that you have complete independent clauses. If you use a semicolon, remember that it has to be between two complete sentences. It has to be an independent clause on both sides of the semicolon. Remember that if you use a colon, you're only going to use one colon per sentence. If you have a sentence with more than one colon, then you've used it incorrectly. If you begin a parenthetical expression with a comma, you have to end it with a comma. If you begin it with a dash, you have to end it with a dash. So those basic grammatical rules that you should know because you've been studying those probably since about third grade. You just got to drill down and find those grammatical rules and be able to find the right answer. Don't shy away from no change. It certainly will help you to pick that.